what have you found is the impact of the of pandemic trauma on like vulnerable communities? So those people that you mentioned, what what has been the impact, or have you seen an impact that's different from non-vulnerable communities?
Yeah, yeah. For the most vulnerable, the issue has been grief, just a lot of unresolved grief issues. And that we have not had enough grief rituals. We need a lot of them. And we need our faith-based faith-based leaders to
Mm-hmm.
jump in there. And I would imagine that they too have been impacted. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why they're now not out front. But we need that so desperately. We need that virtually. We
Yeah.
need that for those people who feel comfortable coming together face to face. We
Mm-hmm.
also need that in every which way. We need to use it in social media. We just need to wake up to dealing with the grief and the loss. You were talking about singing.
Mm-hmm.
Singing and music is one of the best interventions that
Mm-hmm.
human beings can have to be able to deal with grief.
You know, it's interesting that you said that because years ago, Be Strong, we had a training that we talked about what grief looks like at different ages. And and that training on it was just a small piece of it was about grief, but for me it was really impactful. And during the pandemic, I've thought more and more about the impact of grief. And it's funny because my siblings they talk about me and they tease me because the entire pandemic, my focus was like, being gracious to people because there was so much loss. And I kept saying, well, they could be grieving. And it was almost like everything they talked about. I was like, but they could be grieving. And they're like, oh, they got to the point where they would say, oh, we know, Sarita, they're grieving. And I'm like, no, but it's like people don't know that they're in grief. So you don't know how to address it if you don't know that you're grieving. And grieving is so much more than just the loss of a loved one. There was a lot of loss, an insurmountable amount of loss, it seemed to me. I'm not a researcher, but just in my circles, and even now, the amount of people, that have lost people, and then the fact that we were isolated and the loss of a normal way of life and having
Yes,
to move and the
yes,
transitions and loss of jobs and all of that. I was like, how could
yes,
people not be in
yes.
grief? And so when you say that, I'm like, see, I was right. I'm
Mhm.
gonna,
You were right.
Andrew, make sure you clip this so I can share this with them. Thank you.
You are right, though. You are absolutely right. So, little things that can be done, and I'll tell you about what I've done, but little things that can be done. Remember back in primary school when the teacher used to make us or encourage us to create these books where you have a phrase at the beginning and then you answer it on every page? So, this would be I am grieving about, and then the next page the loss of spending time with my friends. The next page, the loss of being with grandma. The next page, the loss of, and each page would talk about that. That is a great project to do as a family, right? Where everybody gets to create a book about grieving over the loss of something during COVID-19. And it's a great way for one to come into consciousness because a lot of times for children, when they're experiencing grief, they often externalize or internalize, and both can be very dangerous. So externalizing might be some acting out behavior. So they might
Mm-hmm.
normally be a very compliant child, and now they're like, no, I don't want to do it. So it becomes very difficult. Or they might be passive aggressive. They say they're going to do something, but then they don't do it. And
Mm-hmm.
parents are frustrated, but it's like, I told you to clean up your room. You said you would, but your room is not clean. And so that could be a sign also of non-compliance, but passive aggressively rather than just, no, I'm not going to do it. So that acting out also could be peer-to-peer, aggression. So we could wonder, why is our child so argumentative these days? Why are they constantly getting into conflict with their siblings? Why are we getting, they're back in school, but now we're getting a lot of behavior referrals. And the teacher is saying, yeah, they're belligerent in class. What is that? What is that irritability that they might have? Well, before we just start saying that they're just a bad kid or they're misbehaving and we go right to disciplining them, stop, breathe, take a minute and ask ourselves, could this be a way in which they're grieving?
And I know
So,
for my,
yeah.
I'm sorry, that just when you were talking, it made me think of my niece who was, my sister kept taking her to the hospital. She kept taking her to the hospital because she was having stomach problems and they couldn't figure out what her, where the problems were coming from. So when you say internalize, I was thinking about that because when she went to grief counseling, and I'm such a, advocate for grief counseling, I was like, you should check out a little company of Mary here in Chicago has a fantastic grieving department. They do for both families, so the parents get it as well as the children. And
Yes.
there she found out that it was grief. She had just lost
Yes.
her grandparents or her grandma she was
Yes.
very close with and spent a lot of time with. And here she was, like she didn't know how to put it in words. She's a very quiet child, very quiet. But her stomach, she was having stomach pains all the time, and it was because of grief. That was like mind blowing for both, me and my sister. My sister and I were like, whoa, whoa, this is
Yes.
deep. This
Yes.
is deep. So thank you for sharing. I'm glad that you shared that because I don't think, and when you think about how much children lost, they lost people, but they also lost like being able to go to school
Yes.
and and having to be home with their freaking parents all day.
Yes.
Just like the parents are tired of the children, a lot of
The
times the
children are
children
tired of
also
the
need a break
parents.
from the
Yes.
parents. So just
Yes.
all of that. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. And I hope you guys took those good tidbits. And then how would it
Yes.
look like? What would it look like for adults? Because I think I feel like adults don't absolutely know either when they're grieving because no one talks about, grief in that way. They always associate it with losing people. But what does that look like for adults if how do they know when they're grieving?
Yeah, yeah. Let me segue into that by
Mm-hmm.
just mentioning what you offered as a perfect example, once again, is children internalizing. So I talked about the externalizing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
internalizing where you get anxiety. So that's what you're referring to. So that's an
Mm-hmm.
internalizing behavioral response. And so you can get that kind of anxiety. You can also get depression. So you get children becoming more withdrawn and so on, staying in their room more often rather than coming out and wanting to be with other people, with the family. Instead, they just stay in their room. They often might oversleep. They're sleeping a lot more than they normally would. Their eating habits might change. They're not hungry or they're too hungry all the time. They're eating all the time. So there could be these
Mm-hmm.
internalizing behaviors as well, which we want to pay attention to. And often they're overlooked because the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So the kids who are acting out, we're going to look at them, pay attention. But the
Mm-hmm.
child who's compliant, but very quiet, we might not pay attention to them. So we get somatization, which is feeling the anxiety in the body. So people might complain about stomach aches, headaches, and things like that. And we want to ask, what does that mean? So
Mm-hmm.
those might be symptoms to look for that are physical symptoms that would represent how they're actually experiencing it emotionally. Adults do the similar thing. So it's important to know as parents, children are not like pre adult humans. They are
Mm-hmm.
humans just at a younger age. So everything that we experience, they're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing. So I have a whole thing that I do talking about infants and toddlers, pre-verbal children, right? And talking about that so that people understand, even as babies laying in a crib, they have a lot of the same things that we're experiencing, but they don't have the ability to express it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we therefore need to attend to those things. So if
Mm-hmm.
we're in a pandemic and we're experiencing COVID-19 and we have a baby, don't ignore the baby and think they're just a baby. What do they know? They're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing a lot of the tension and anxiety as a result of how we're managing,
Mm-hmm.
but we're not addressing it. And there are things that we can do, even with babies, to provide them with what was known as infant mental health or pediatric counseling. So that's important. So to
Wow.
transition over to adults, as adults, we also will experience irritation, and we'll see that perhaps in our work relationships. And it might be in the sense of we normally get a lot of excitement about being at work to dreading to go to work. We don't want to go to work now. We want to take a day off instead. We need to have time alone. We don't want to be with people. So our enjoyment around work, our enjoyment around socializing, our enjoyment around hobbies and so forth are diminished. And also our sense of empathy for other people. So that's where you see with adults, we have seen increase in domestic violence. We've seen an increase in community violence. We've seen an increase in violence in driving. Like a lot of vehicular issues have grown exponentially. And so these are all things that I would suggest are symptoms of the agitation, irritation of being in COVID, and how difficult it has been for us to deal with not only the grief, but the change in our lifestyle, anxiety about how we're going to pay the rent or the mortgage or whatever, how we're going to make ends meet. During this time, we've got supply chain issues going on right now. We've got inflation and the increased cost of just getting groceries.
Yeah.
And these are related to COVID-19. So because of COVID-19, we've got the supply chain issue, which is causing this domino effect for us. We've got the great resignation going on, where people are having existential crises of, well, hey, if I'm gonna die tomorrow, let me do what I want to do in my last few days. So you know what? Take this job and shove it. I didn't like it anyway. So we've got the great resignation where people are saying, I'd rather live on a mountain somewhere and farm my food rather than go and work in corporate America one more minute. I'd rather do this than to do that, which is also causing more problems in terms of staffing, of going to restaurants. And I know you've experienced it going to a restaurant. It is not the same experience. They don't have enough staff. The hours have changed. Just all kinds of stuff. Life has changed. And so we're waiting to see whether or not there's been the uncertainty. And it's like, and I know I've been talking about COVID since March 2020. I've done so many webinars in talking about it. And my slides keep changing about what do we know about COVID and what's the latest information. It changes sometimes day to day. I have to keep checking World Health Organization website. I have to keep checking CDC. I have to keep finding out what are these epidemiologists saying. And here I am on 3 NIH grants, and 2 of them are related to COVID. I'm working with pharmacists and so on. And yes, I'm constantly checking what is going on. If I'm having that difficulty and I'm engaged in this research around this, as people who are just trying to figure out, should I wear a mask? Should I not wear a mask? Should I go to work? The information is confusing. That uncertainty is also anxiety producing. At one point I was saying to myself, I think I was visiting my sister in Atlanta, and I was walking on the trail. And I was like, I cannot believe that I'm scared of every human being that I encounter on this trail. I am terrified of humans. And I'm like, I got to do something. I got to do something about this, because all we've got is each other. We only have each other as humans. And so we are only put on this planet to be in relationship with other humans. That's our only purpose for being on the planet. And so that is, in a nutshell, the challenge of COVID-19. Our very essence of why we exist as human beings is challenged. And so we are constantly trying to figure out, how can I have relationship? How can I have relationship and not be afraid of humans? How can I do that? And so we need to keep doing that. And this is one of those things. So thanks to you in creating these webinars to keep people connected, because that keeps us human and that keeps us
Yeah.
alive and well.